Thank you so much, dear Tara, for being here. Reading your book, Moksha, Liberation, has been such a wonderful treat for our Sangha, and what a cherry on top to be able to ask you some questions about you and spirituality and our book. I know that there's a lot of people in our audience that can relate to a woman's journey to self-discovery and freedom from suffering, as we all can. So I delight in having you here. Thank you. I wanted to begin with an invocation before we get to the questions. Sahana bhavatu, sahanao bhunaktu, sahaviryam karva vahai tejasvina vadhitamastu ma vidvisha vahai. Om Shanti Shanti Shanti.
So before we begin, may I have a small invocation to Guru?
Please be my guest.
Om Shri Guru Pyo Namaha Harihi Om. Salutations to Swami Tadatmananda at the Arsha Bodha Center. Salutations to you, Lyam, and to your Sangha, and of course to Sky Guardian. Namaste and pleasure to be here.
Yes, very grateful for Sky Guardian for helping organize this. I like to compare him to the force-carrying particles in physics that mediate interactions. He's very good at delivering information between various spiritual teachers and spiritual seekers.
He got us to meet, so that's something.
Exactly. So let me dive right into it.
Okay.
At what point in your life or journey did you become inspired to document the remembering of the divinity in you?
You know, I grew up in India, and the whole country is so imbued with the divinity. You can't get away from the divine. So as far as documenting, remembering, there wasn't any real remembering, because it's not that I always felt divine, but it's always there. I mean, as you might know, right now, 400 million people are gathered on the banks of the Ganges for Kumbh Mela, just to be able to dip their toes in the river. And it's always there. And it's not even related to any religion. Christians, Muslims, Hindus, they all go to churches and temples and all that when they have a free moment. So there was no one moment. It was always there. My parents were spiritual seekers. My father was educated in the West, and he did not like the trappings of religion, but he was very much a seeker and took us to all kinds of interesting places like Aurobindo's ashram and famous temples. My mother had a little altar, but she also was a scientist, and she knew Sanskrit and read it. So it was always around. When I wrote the book, I have the protagonist remembering, and I was documenting that in terms of her remembering. And I had to really study Vedanta in a very serious fashion, not just casually. So I don't know if that answers the question. But that's as far as, it's the way you're brought up. My father was very funny. He didn't like the trappings of religion, but my sister and I made noise over misbehaving. One of his punishments, I remember, was making us memorize 2 Sanskrit verses from a great text I now realize, didn't know at the time, I was 7 years old, which I still remember. He always did little odd things like that. So God was always sort of around, some kind of feeling about it. The study of Vedanta itself came much later.
So being immersed in that culture since you were young and having a father who was a seeker, it was only natural for you to be surrounded by the subject of divinity. And as you were mentioning, as you got older, you got to begin to understand the means of really coming into contact with that divinity directly through
and that's ongoing. Yeah. My father, in fact, went to the Shivananda ashram north of Montreal. It's a hatha yoga place, but they also teach Vedanta. So all the great yoga teachers took their training course, and he went there and knew Vishnu Devananda Swami. And then I went there later myself. So my parents are sort of leading the way. They were always like 2 steps ahead. That was very helpful.
Well, that's something that I'm grateful for as well. Having parents that have been an inspiration to allow me to find the things that speak true to my spiritual journey. And it's nice to see that mirrored in your story too. So in Moksha, there's all sorts of calamities that begin to arise, given the Kali Yuga, the age of darkness, approaching at perhaps an even more alarming rate when our protagonist, who is secretly Uma, the consort of Shiva, having forgotten her true self, How did you come to forecast or know or just become familiar with what the calamities are in this world? I mean, it seems so fitting given that there's fires in California and the Hollywood Hills, earthquakes and Southeast Asia, typhoons, etc. Where does that knowledge or your intuition come from?
It's funny. I'm not at all psychic or a soothsayer of prophesy. Not an ounce. My mother had a bit of a sixth sense, but not me. This book took a long time, mostly because I had to actually understand the teachings. I kept thinking I understood something, then I realized I didn't and all that. But when I was writing it at the time, I was setting the book in some point. The Sri Lankan war was mentioned and so on. So it was a little hazy about that. I'm an architect. I noticed climate change and the effect, especially in San Francisco. We were starting to build buildings to deal with sea rise and so on, when people were actually saying that nothing's going to happen. But I thought I'd look it up. And it was very interesting because you can actually find out the UN and the WHO and all that, when they chart disasters. In fact, you can go on the internet and say disasters by year. And I was appalled because you're aware of disasters that's happening in your community or your country, but you don't know that something's happening somewhere else at the same time. All the calamities I list were ones that were really going on at the year I picked for the book. And at that time, people were talking about climate change and so forth. And at that time, I thought, well, things couldn't get any worse. But, there were wildfires in Siberia at the time, huge cyclones and typhoons and this and that going on all simultaneously in a particular year. Then the next year, it might die down, but it'll get worse. And generally, the disasters have been getting worse. But I thought we'd turn it around. And that was like 2014 to 10 years ago. But to my horror, it's gotten much worse. And this year has been particularly bad. In the book, the gods are looking at the planet. If there were going to be calamities from their point of view, it would have to encase the planet. So I had to sort of chart where everything was going. But everything I said in there was actually taken from the headlines at the time. If I weren't writing the book, I wouldn't have known there was a big typhoon that killed 100,000 people somewhere. And I do keep in touch with the Indian tragedies. There were some huge earthquakes. Bangladesh had severe floods. And we're now having all these problems. And unfortunately, we haven't been able to get behind this. Human beings, I think, are great at problem solving. And I wish we could just decide there's a problem and do something about it. But there seems to be a lot of apathy in some areas. Some countries are doing a lot. It can be done. I'm hopeful. But I never prophesied any of this. Anything in the book, like the robbing of the aquifers and all that, it's actually true. The refugee crisis, child abuse, all of that is taken from actual factual events.
It makes a lot of sense.
I don't have the imagination for it.
You don't need siddhis to figure this out. Just pay attention to world news.
Yeah. And you can get it because you have access.
Well, I really appreciate the touch of Vedanta sprinkled in there. I love with the equation of Atman equals Brahman, that in essence, we are one with everything else. Everything is a ripple, a wave on the same ocean. And I think what you share is a very practical implementation of that, just being aware of the life that is ongoing in the world besides just what's happening here with this body, this mind, this neighborhood. If you can empathize with what another human is going through, then that is a very real practical application of that Vedantic truth that the self in me is non-different in essence with the self in you. In Moksha, the one who was teaching that to our protagonist was, of course, Sid, along with many other teachers along the way. But Sid had a habit, as it appears, to leave during some of the most important times and coming back years later, or maybe not at all. Like at the end of the book, it seemed like Sid was not expected to return. So what is the implication there with Sid leaving them?
Lord Shiva, the god in the stories, is a really fascinating character. And I shouldn't call him a character. He's just a fascinating being. And as a deity, he is considered even pre-Aryan. He's sort of the oldest ancient beings that you see. Shiva lingas in ancient culture, Mahindra and all that, well before the Aryan gods. And then the way he's described, I find extraordinary because he's whimsical. He's sometimes drunk. He dances in graves and he he's extraordinary. And the Puranas treat him in such a beautiful way. And he has no caste. He doesn't care, but he knows what's going on. And he's a great ascetic. He meditates and he's finally the boss. He just disappears. He's whimsical in a sense. In the Purana story, the relationship between Shiva, the female, and the male, Prakriti and Purusha, they're always devoted to each other completely. He's a family man. He's not interested in other women and all that, but he's always having a big argument. They argue about everything. There are lots of funny stories about how she gets mad and she does this and he does that. She's gone and lost her memory because he didn't bring back some garlands that she wanted. And for good reason, he was saving a bunch of people against demons, but she wouldn't have any of it. So he's trying hard to bring her back, but he can't. He's finding it very difficult. So the fact that at some point he just says, oh, well, I'm off, is because she has to do it herself. He can't spoon feed her. He can't make her understand. And Vedantic teachings in the Shiva Puranas are in the ancient, the most earliest Shiva Puranas include Vedanta teachings. And Shiva, of course, is the author of the Vedas, which he can read. I needed a framework to write this. And I thought this incident, it was only an incident in the Puranas, of her losing her memory and he teaching her Vedanta to get it back, was a good way to present it. So it's sort of what we would call a conceit of using the story to teach Vedanta. My sister is the one who sort of had a dare, like, can you put the Vedanta teachings into a fictional novel? It's a genre by itself. It's called a didactic novel, a teaching novel. So there's another word. So I had to squeeze it in, but I had to have some reason for somebody teaching somebody Vedanta, and who could do it better than the author of it. So all I can say to answer your question, that's what he does. He comes and goes. He's not a goody two-shoes who's always dependable and all that. I just find that extraordinarily wonderful myself. It suits me. Now, the other gods, of course, have their Vishnu, who's Hari. He's trying to preserve things. He's trying to make the planet better, trying to get people to organize themselves. So he's pretty frustrated himself, but he's a different aspect of divinity, I guess.
That makes a lot of sense to me. I mean, the personality of Shiva is very there in the character, and reading the Puranas is very clear how there's a playful kind of disagreement, but not a real deep one that actually separates the love that they have for each other, but just adds to the leelas, the divine plays, pastimes of this world. It's also about giving space for Uma to have her independence, to really discover herself.
You're putting it a lot better.
Oh, I'm just making sure I understand.
I should also mention that he does leave, but Nandi is around. And Nandi, the bull, but in this case, I've changed it. Nandi in the Puranas has a lot to do with Uma Parvati getting back her memory. I saw that and I thought, well, I'll make Nandi a teacher and make it a woman teacher so that it can give it a little bit of more modern take. And he knows that when he leaves. He knows that the person who's going to get to her is Nandi. And he sort of leaves it up to. And Nandi in the Puranas is the greatest devotee of Shiva. These devotees have categories. He's way on top.
Nandi and Shiva and Uma are part of the cast of divine beings, but there's a whole other ensemble of the asuras, the demonic beings as well, such as Gerhardt and his industry in general. Some of my astute listeners were commenting on how there are lots of similarities between that corporation and many in the modern world, and they were wondering if you were modeling Gerhardt Industries after any in particular, if any, and why?
Well, definitely. Again, I couldn't come up with it myself, but there are large corporations that have tremendous power, and they particularly go into countries that are somewhat desperate and defenseless and just take what they can. There's deforestation and fires and mining, and even to the point of child labor and child trafficking. All these things go on so that they can make a buck. There are some companies that are publicly held that have outrageous records, both environmental and also human degradation. When it's a publicly held company, they have only one goal, which is to maximize shareholder value. They have to do that. If they don't see their profits go up, the CEO gets fired right away. And that's our only method of a company being successful. They don't take into consideration, well, they did some good work. In fact, if a a company becomes socially responsible and they don't make the projected profits, then they lose out in the game. So I'm not excusing it, but I see it's a system that doesn't allow for them to do good. They're ruthless. Then there are privately held companies where a family just hides behind the company. You don't know about them. I don't need to name names. You just have to go on the internet, and it's frightening. The Amazon rainforests have the devastation there has been phenomenal. Now, they always say that, oh, we're going to change our policy and this and that and all. And at the time I was writing it, they were talking about a 2030 viewpoint at which, things will be corrected and changed and this and that. Well, we're in 2025. It seemed like a far off point, but now 2030 is like a tipping point for the Amazon rainforest and so on. And what is quite surprising to me is that these billionaires and so on, they don't understand that their grandchildren and so on are going to have to solve this problem if they don't, or their children, in fact. Now we might even be going into using fossil fuel. It's astonishing to me that people don't see it, that the Amazon rainforest are the lungs of the planet, and that we're all sort of connected just physically. If the Amazon forest dies, everyone suffers. It's not restricted to a group of people that we don't care about. That sort of thinking is really horrible. I mean, the British Empire in India, for instance, they came and they cut down all the forests. We're talking about 1850s and so on, turned the whole place into a desert. They didn't replace it. And what were the forests cut for? So that they could make this very ugly Victorian furniture in England. So there was no sensitivity to that. They didn't realize that things at some point can't be replaced. So in answer to that, I don't want to get into trouble by naming names.
That's completely understandable.
It's very easy to find out. Very easy.
Well, you continue to inspire me in that you raise awareness for things that people should be, and also validate how much us, especially in the West, are increasingly concerned about these things. You also have a very adept way of drawing from Western influences. In the 15th chapter, for example, one of the texts that Uma was studying from was the Panchadasi, but it was placed between Ayn Rand and a Margaret Atwood book. Were those books Fountainhead and Handmaid's Tale, respectively, if anything specific at all? Or was there any significance of these two books for you, or these two authors?
It's funny because I'm so delighted that somebody noticed it, because it was very intentional. You have to realize she has a master's in literature from Yale, so she will make literary references, maybe quote poet here and there. But in this case, Ayn Rand, it's not the Fountainhead, it's Atlas Shrugged, which was a later book. But she wrote this book in the 1950s, almost 60 years ago, about how we should get rid of all the social programs because people are poor because they don't work hard enough. And the real heroes of society are the people who create wealth and are wealthy and so on and so forth. I read it in college. She said that human beings are sort of self-interest, but essentially selfish. And we should be, and we should, that was in the 1950s. But strangely enough, we're hearing that kind of rhetoric now. Again, I thought it had died a happy death, but she was very dystopian. It was very depressing. So that was her view of the world. And what was hilarious, she said that we should take away all the social programs that help people who are in need. But then she made a ton of money and then lost it all. And towards the end of her life, she was depending on social security and welfare. She became very poor and then was dependent. So she sort of learned something that sometimes you can't really make it. You need something of a safety net. And if the country can afford it, it's great. Atwood, Handmaid's Tale, is also dystopian. It's an ugly projection of the world of the future where there are slaves and masters and the terrible situation. And that's her view of the future. Panchadashi, sitting between those two books that have very dismal theories and ideas for the future, is a delightful text written in the 15th century. And so I thought it was sort of funny that Om Depot as a bookshop is eclectic. And these things are all very deliberate on part of the gods, that she has to find Panchadashi. She has to do it herself. She might pick up Atwood's book instead and not even notice this text. So that was the idea. It was sort of whimsical on my part, but I'm so glad somebody caught that. I didn't explain it at all. There are things I didn't explain. You either get it or not. So.
I noticed that you leave many Easter eggs, as it were, to find in your writing, which I think makes for an excellent parallel with Puranic Puranic influences, given that there's so much there to extract, so much there to meditate on or contemplate on. Speaking of which, you had mentioned that the bookstore was named Om Depot. Why did you decide to name the bookstore Om Depot?
I describe it as a sliver between two buildings. It's like the opposite of Home Depot. Not that I have anything against Home Depot, but the big box stores, which are so convenient. This thing was the opposite. First of all, nothing's organized. Everything's a mess. And then, of course, Om being a sacred sound, I just thought it was very clever on my part to make that. It was just a joke, but it's also the difference. I'm a great reader, and idea that all these tiny bookshops are disappearing or have actually disappeared and we have to go through Amazon something to get anything is very depressing. But that's what's happened, and Home Depot is sort of a holdout against that.
A good spiritual pun. I like the connections. Om, of course, in classical Indian philosophy is the sound that generates all other sounds, and by extension, the whole universe. And sound, of course, being the original medium of delivering information, especially in the oral traditions of both the Aryans and the Dravidians of the South. And of course, that later became written down at some point, or maybe it was originally as well, but we lost the script. And so it makes very fitting sense that you'd find a bookstore named after the source of sound and language.
Oh, that's true too. Actually, I didn't think of that, but yeah. That's lovely. Thank you. Yeah.
Of course. So many characters in Moksha were able to identify Uma's divinity. That's their purpose, of course, being incarnated to help her realize who she is. But do you think that people are able to perceive another person's divinity before they realize their own?
In our normal day-to-day life, yes. I mean, at least my experience has been, you see someone, in fact, I saw someone today, and you suddenly look at them and you think, gosh, there's something incredible about a person. It might be a person at a checkout at the store or something. We do see that. We don't always understand it, but there are people walking around who have that shining attitude, and they don't necessarily have to be swamis or teachers or something. They're just people. Yes, we do have that tendency before we see it in ourselves. The point about Vedanta, of course, is that's all well and good, but the important thing is to find that divinity in yourself and find yourself and know it, not wish for it or think about it, but actually physically know it mentally. So yes, I would say so. That's just a thing. And the most important thing is our own divinity, recognizing it, which we don't. We're always beating ourselves up. Yeah.
It's the spiritual equivalent of putting your oxygen mask on first. Recognize the divinity within before others.
Exactly.
The last of the main questions from the Sangha was, is it to be concluded that once one comes to moksha, that life is to be lived unattached and in service to humanity?
Detachment or unattachment and service to humanity are all actually prerequisites to even studying Vedanta. Shankaracharya is very strict about that. He's the great teacher of Vedanta from 780. You have to develop all those qualities before you can even study Vedanta. What Vedanta is doing is directing you to know who you are, to the point, tattvam asi, you are that. And knowing is through knowledge. And it's sort of like finally figuring out that 2 + 2 is equal to 4. Once you know that, you're never going to go back on it. If somebody comes to you and says it's 5, you know it's not. So you have to know it for a fact. You have to know that you are Brahman and Atman and consciousness. So when enlightenment occurs, that knowledge has dawned. So supposing you were a doctor or even a bricklayer and then you are enlightened, what happens after that is not that you become detached and so forth. You know you are Atman, and the next day you continue being a doctor or a bricklayer, but with this knowledge, your suffering disappears. What you're seeing before you, you understand it as appearances, you get that knowledge. And it's not that after enlightenment you serve humanity. You're always expected to do that well before that on the path to enlightenment. At least with Vedanta, that's taught by the Saraswati orders and Ramakrishna missions and so forth, the preparation to even begin studying Vedanta is a pretty high bar. And on the path to enlightenment, you have to be leading a very dharmic life. The English word is righteous, which doesn't sound good, but a very good life, be a good person, which implies service to humanity. After enlightenment, of course, you would be continuing that, but it's a prerequisite before. After enlightenment, what happens is you yourself have a huge transformation, and it's freedom from suffering and hopefully freedom from rebirth. You just know who you are. That's what happens.
I like that. Or putting the cart before the bull. Not moksha as a prerequisite to seva, but seva being a prerequisite to moksha.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, it's not easy.
So those were the main questions, but I did misspeak a little. There were 3 more questions from the Sangha, and then I had some questions from myself. Simply put, did the main character remember completely that she was Parvati and Siddha was Shiva?
Yeah, it took her a while. And the reason why it took her so long and all these horrible things she had to go through was because her ignorance was profound. Like her ignorance was this thick black. I mean, you and I are not as ignorant as she was because she was... she was so in a fog that she didn't recognize her own children. Parvati and Shiva have 2 sons, Ganesha and Murugan, who's Muthu. Their stories are another gigantic number of issues, but she doesn't recognize them. She doesn't know this, but she's always thinking that she's on the right path, but she's sort of clueless. And so it takes Nandi, basically, they have to continually be reinforcing it. She gets down to losing everything, being a servant, and finally her ego and everything get to the bare bones. And after 14 years, she does know that she is who she is. And it's a little subtle there, I think, maybe too much. She writes a letter to her 2 sons who are out near the equator planting trees to save the planet. And she says, we need to go home. And home is Mount Kailash, which is an actual mountain. It's located in Tibet, which is now China. And a lot of the Shiva Puranas takes place on Kailash. That's where they live. That's where all the ghouls and the demons and Nandi and Shiva and Parvati and the 2 sons. And I think there's a daughter also at some point. And these are gods, when they're avatars, they have their jobs to do. And once the job's over, they go back. The idea is that she becomes enlightened herself in that, like in her letter, I think it's like the 3rd paragraph, she sort of tells them, what is it? And people do ask, is enlightenment like a light bulb going out? You suddenly have an ooh and 1,000 suns or something. And mystics do have these experiences, but that's not what Vedanta's enlightenment is all about. And she says that the way it happens, and I think this is probably true, is that we are all carrying this huge load, and the load just starts dropping off. As you get towards enlightenment, you're just feeling lighter and lighter. And I think that's a very nice way to explain it. It's not sudden, it's not dramatic, and you suddenly know. So that's what she tells. And then they know that they are all going to go home. And if you actually go to Mount Kailash, which is a very sacred mountain for Buddhists and Hindus, there's a lake right next to it, Lake Manasarovar. And in the Purana, she used to bathe in the lakes, Parvati in her prime. And they used to play chess, or the 2 of them, and have a lot of fun there. So I mentioned the lake as well, but I don't explain it.
I really love that feeling you described of enlightenment not being some dramatic exposition or experience, or, the heavens open up and fireworks go off, but just what remains after a very simple process of releasing, of coming to settle into one's natural state. It is the opposite of dramatic. You touched on Uma having to come to that realization after 14 years, or during the 14 years. What is the significance of that during such a dreadful place and time?
14 years is the number of years in the Ramayana where Rama and Sita vanished to the forest. It's a kind of symbolic number. I think I'd heard it in some other context as well. And I just used it as a time frame. I'm not a great scholar about any of these epics, but I just thought that would be appropriate amount of time. I didn't want to say 10 years or something. I just thought 14 was such an odd number. Some people thought, well, why don't you explain that?
I know it does have significance in various parts of Hinduism, such as the 14 lokas. Wondering if that was in mind.
Numerology is a very fascinating thing in the Hindu system. So,
but it wasn't that deep. Just a nice number and a nice reference to the exile of Ram.
Yeah, and for some reason, I was determined to not make the book more than maximum of 200 to 250 pages. I wanted to keep it very tight. And then someone said, why don't you have a map of India drawing where she was? Because people were confused, where is Rishikesh? Where is Lake Dodital, for example? Or where she goes on the trek with Sid. And where is Rameshwaram? And nobody knows, right? Even Indians don't know. So why don't you put in a map? Why don't you put a glossary? Why don't you explain this, that, and the other thing? Because I have some gods in there that I don't explain. Like her driver, Jatayu, is a bird from the Ramayana. But I didn't want to make it a textbook in that sense. I just wanted to be a little bit of a fantasy because you put in a map and all that, it suddenly gets very real. Secondly, there's the internet. If you want to type in Lake Dodital in the Himalayas, you'll see it on Google Earth. It's actually a tiny little lake way up in the mountains. There's actually a lake. That's where Ganesha was born. I feel that as a reader, I will do that. And if it's on Kindle or something, you can actually click on any proper name and you'll see an explanation. So I'm assuming people will do that, but apparently not. So I got a lot of complaints about who's this and what happened there?
So here's a fun question for you. Was there any hidden implications or maybe personal secret intentions for the book or lessons that you've implanted? And would you be willing to share any?
No, actually, no secrets at all. In fact, I wish there were. What I did, didactic novels are difficult. And a famous one is Hermann Hesse's Siddhartha or Paul Coelho's The Alchemist. But those novels have teaching in them of something that the authors have discovered. So Siddhartha is what Hermann Hesse thought and so on. I want to present the Vedanta teachings very precisely the way they were, and I wanted to cover all of them. So I didn't dare change anything at all. And these are teaching methodologies. So I got about 20 of them, or I made a list and I couldn't put all of them in there. But I thought for a beginner or someone who knows nothing, this is an introduction that they can go and study. And there's so many good teachers on the internet that will do that. So no, I'm completely open. Did someone think there was a secret? I wish there were.
I'm not entirely sure what the premise of this question includes for them, but your writing style, I do know, is very unique in the way that it leaves a lot of room for imagination, which I like, because I don't like stories that completely walk you through absolutely every little detail and hold your hand. That you give the audience the ability to use their intellect, use their imagination. And I think that might feel for some readers that you had a specific thing in mind during some of those transitions between different times or different scenes, that you're supposed to figure out something in particular, but maybe one that's secret to you. I don't know. I'm just speculating on the spot.
I know it's been a difficult read for most people as a book. Your reading of it was very wonderful for me because you had very nice commentary to kind of tie the pieces together and so on, which you don't get when you read the book. So the book is actually quite obscure. And so I really appreciated that. And I so enjoyed listening to it. And I didn't write it for it to be a bestseller to be sold in airport. I wrote it to just put this down. And the people who got it were few in number, but they got it in the sense that they knew they had to go back and read something, that they just couldn't read it from beginning to end and get it. They had to go back. And one particularly sort of poignant story is one of my classmates from high school. She was interested in the Upanishads. She was learning a little Sanskrit. She had some background and she started reading it and she was going back and forth. And she told me that she had to go back. She said, you don't make it easy. Anyway, she ended up being diagnosed with lung cancer and she got very sick very quickly. And then while she was very sick, she told me that the Vedanta teachings about death and freedom from suffering and all that was very helpful when she was ill. And she passed away. And I was very touched by having had some small contribution to her feeling a little better when she was suffering. remembering quite a bit. So that was that. Then people have told me, a poet said she had written poems with these similar themes, not knowing it was Vedanta. And so I had some good responses that way, but it's not easy. I realize that.
It sounds like you had a lot of people in your life in mind while writing and sharing this book. It's beautiful. Speaking of Sanskrit, people were wondering your relationship with it. If you are learned in Sanskrit, obviously, if you are a student of Vedanta, you have to learn many Sanskrit words which are used in the book. Do you know Sanskrit or?
No, but I'm obsessed with it. I don't know why. I was much more interested in Sanskrit than in Vedanta, in fact. And I came dashing over to New Jersey because Sanskrit is not taught. I was at Berkeley. I was in San Francisco. Couldn't find a Sanskrit teacher. Berkeley gave courses, but it was all American students. They didn't know the script. It was very difficult. But the minute I heard Sanskrit as a child, it's what I wanted to learn. And it took me this long to actually find a teacher at the Asha Buddhist Center, Basanti ji, and took her course for 3 years. It made a big difference to me. You don't need to learn Sanskrit to learn about Vedanta because translations, but you do have to have a teacher. The teacher should know Sanskrit, like Swami Tadatmananda is known. Sanskrit is such a huge miracle to me. And I'm so happy that I actually have a slight advantage in that I know the Devanagari script. I've heard Sanskrit before. It's not brand new to me. It would be very difficult, but I was quite shocked by how complicated it was. And it's much better to learn it when you're 10 years old than at a later age because memory is important. You do have to memorize things. And there are a million rules and not a thing about it that doesn't have a rule. So it's very logical. It's mathematical almost. And there are people who are looking at it as a computational language. So no, I'm not fluent in it. I'm struggling. I'm still learning. It's going to take 40 years. When we started the 3-year course, we were all sitting there. We were all sort of, not exactly young things. And we realized it's going to take way longer than we have time before we go into the next world. But it's very enjoyable. I highly recommend it, but it's very rare to find a good teacher. Vasanti's classes are online, but I did have somewhere as a child. And my mother was always reading. She was reading the entire Ramayana in Sanskrit, but I didn't pay any attention. I was busy doing other things.
Well, I certainly share a deep reverence for the language as you do. I sometimes feel like there's almost a bhakti, a sort of loving devotion for the soundscape. And dropping in on Vasanti ji's classes myself a few times, I do recall her mentioning that she has a 3-year course, but it's really an infinity-year course because there's always something more that you can learn to study. As a quick aside, as a fascination, sometimes I like to explore the Devanagari script and the soundscape of Sanskrit in general that you might appreciate. I once had someone create a set of dice that had the soundscape of Sanskrit on it. I think I accidentally made the focus lock on my face. I think they might be blurry. But one thing that's really interesting to me, aren't they? I was so happy with how they turned out. You can map all of the sounds in Sanskrit minus all of the sounds formed by Sandhi onto this geometry of 5 8-sided dice, each one of them representing a different place in the mouth. I thought you might appreciate that, especially given that you're an architect. There's a geometry.
I thought of it. It's wonderful. Yeah.
Yeah. Coming from my background in mathematics, I love to explore the structures of these sounds.
Yeah. Panini, put it all together in like 500 BC. Yeah. We always used to say in the Sanskrit class, what was he thinking? And like how many people did he employ to put this thing together? And did he have like Microsoft a workforce? And of course, how could one man it's so beautiful.
It's truly incredible. It wouldn't be the same without that language.
No, it wouldn't. And I think if you know the Sanskrit word for something somehow, and maybe you need to know an Indian language or something, but anyway, at least the English translation of any word, like even ahankara being ego, is not correct. And so if you know a little bit of ahankara being I-ness, little I-ness and so on, it somehow drops all the baggage that the word ego has. It's much gentler. Even the word consciousness, which covers so many words in Sanskrit. So, and the Gita Sanskrit is simpler. The Upanishad is Vedic Sanskrit, which is impossible. And you do need someone to teach that that to you whether you know Sanskrit or not. It's not understandable. So the dice, what is it made out of?
Oh, I'm not sure. Some kind of resin, I think. Just like an ordinary die. Yeah.
But it's solid.
Oh, yeah. Just a quick check on the time. I only asked for an hour. If you have anywhere to go, of course, I'll respect that. But I did have a few more questions for you.
Okay. I could talk to you forever.
Perfect. Those are all the questions from my Sangha. I noticed while reading Moksha personally that there's a lot of inspiration, of course, from Vedanta, being that's the whole purpose, to extol the truths of Advaita Vedanta, especially. At the end of the book, you reference, of course, various Vedanta teachers such as Swami Tarapanandaji, Sarva, Priyananda. But there's also very clearly Puranic influence. You had already kind of covered that the early Puranas have a lot of Vedanta in them. But what certainly is unique to Moksha liberation is your use of a few Tantric elements, which is often not employed, as far as I know, in Vedantic context. So I was wondering how you balance inspirations from the Puranas and the Bhakti traditions with Tantra as well as your Vedanta.
The Tantra, I actually heard someone speak on the Kashmiri Shaivism once when I was at some conference. The Tantric practices are also a path to enlightenment. I felt I should give it its due a little bit. And there are two Saraswati Swamis who have written a book, which I have in the appendix. It's a kind of unusual practice. Now, the Saraswati order, like Swami Tadapananda and so on, don't accept those because it's physical, it's sexual, it's got certain practices. But you have to read about people who've actually gone through the practice. And people in search of enlightenment can still go to maybe not Kashmir today, but in India and go through a tantric process. I remember Kundalini, Swami Tadapananda has actually done a video on it. You know, they're renunciates, sannyasis. This is not something that's within their purview. So he did go through the awakening of the Kundalini in the spine. I don't fully understand the physical nature of that, but I felt I should give a passing reference. And then we have this wonderful text where Shiva is explaining things to Parvati, who's sitting on his lap. And that I think is so funny because it is depicted in many pictures and paintings of that. And he teaches 112 meditations. Osho, who sometimes not given actually the credit he's due, but he has a very good book explaining each one of the 112 meditations. And they are very nicely done. What I wanted to put in these 200 and plus pages of mine is every single avenue. And this is one. It's very legitimate. And for some people, it might work. There's own different ways, the teaching methodologies. And this one is not particularly accepted. But in some cases, it is the way to do it. When I heard this man talk about it, I sort of thought that was interesting. And it sort of softens my story because Shiva and Parvati come together. I mean, they are a single person, a single being, rather. So at some point, they should come together physically. But they don't consummate the union because she doesn't know who he is, because she doesn't know who she is. And so he can't have anything to do with her. I mean, he's the one who turns her down, essentially. I don't know if that answers your question, but it's just
absolutely.
A thing.
No, it makes a lot of sense. There are how many, 10 different Swami orders or something like that?
Yeah.
Saraswati lineage is one with the big influence on you and I, and they're of course very clear with their own methods. But someone like Swami Sarva Priyananda that comes from the Ramakrishna Math, I believe Ramakrishna's guru or one of his gurus was Hotapuri, so I think they're the Puri lineage. I notice when listening to their Vedanta, it often draws from sources that you might consider Tantrika or related. So it definitely depends on the lineage. And also your story is not just about Vedanta, but about Shiva, about Parvati. And they are not just icons in Vedanta. They are absolutely icons in all sorts of different traditions and methods of achieving enlightenment. So I think you've really done Shiva justice by...
You can't not. But also, the Indian aspect to the gods, Krishna and all that, you know, in Hindi, for example, you have a respectful you, thou, and you have a regular you. So when you address your parents and all that, you use the respectful you, or even an elder brother or sister or something. For a child, you use that, it's aap or tu, and there's tum in the middle. Tu is for the lowest. So servants, children, whatever. But to God, you use tu because it's very familiar. So I've always just think, my gosh, why not? Because I'd gone to Catholic schools and all that. God, you have to respect and all. But it means I have this very playful relationship. And with Sri Krishna especially, the divine is playing with you all the time. We're all being there. So yeah, it's a different way of trying to find who you are.
That's fascinating. I didn't know that about Hindi, for example, that you'd use the middle one to address a god, a deity.
No, you use the last one. There are like three, actually. There's Aap for above you, Tum for your contemporaries, like your friends, and Tu for children and anybody below. Then for God, you use Tu.
Oh, so it's even lower than...
It's even lower, yeah. It's how you would address a child and someone lower in a caste or something, but you would always address God as Tu. So
I find that really beautiful. Yeah. I see children as very close to divine, being fresh out the womb, coming from the source. It reminds me of a quote that even the most mischievous child is closer to God than the holiest priest. So I had just one more question for you, dear Tara. And it was a question that dear Sky Guardian wanted to address, which was if you could explain how you navigate Advaita, Vedanta, and Buddhism. There was a question that you asked Swamiji in Satsang in May of last year, I believe, where you had asked about a translation of Sunyata, I believe, which is traditionally regarded as emptiness. And there's lots of overlap between Buddhism and Advaita Vedanta. Many people consider the teachings of the Buddha to be complementary in many ways. So there isn't really a precise question in there other than if you could explore what the overlap is for you with Buddhism and Advaita Vedanta, especially under the tutelage of Swamiji.
I shouldn't really say this, but there's sort of a rivalry between Vedanta and Buddhism. I happened to go on this trip with some American Buddhist monks to China, and I learned a lot about Buddhism and so forth, Zen Buddhism. China is a huge resurgence of Buddhism. The Buddhist temples that were burned down are been rebuilt exactly the way they were before, except they're brand new. They look absolutely gorgeous. The Chinese government had gone overboard with reproducing the monasteries and so on. So I learned a lot about Buddhism. One of the people in there was a scholar who translated Zen poetry and so on. One of the great translators of Zen works, historic works. And he changed the word emptiness, which is shunyavada, to boundlessness. Everyone is quite shocked by that because it's always been emptiness. With Vedanta, it's fullness. We think consciousness is fullness, and the Vedantins make fun of the idea of emptiness because you can't say that the world is empty when you're making the observation because you're there. So how could you be there? So that's sort of an argument. So I was sort of curious about it, having taken that little trip, him having changed the word. So I was asking Swami Tadatmananda, who had not heard that and so was not able to shed any light.
Shunya means shunya.
He is a great scholar in Buddhism as well. And he made the argument that they're actually the same. Emptiness is actually not a good translation. It's very nihilistic, it's very negative, but it's not. So I don't like to put one thing down in favor of another. I think they're both sides of the same coin. And Swami Sarvapriyananda has a very good set of lectures on the Mandukya Upanishad. There's 69 lectures. The whole commentary is worth listening to. And he does do a lot about Buddhism within that, and I heard that, and I like that idea. Buddha himself didn't worry about any of this. He just wanted people to deal with suffering, the full forward path and all that. He didn't get into it. He was very well versed in the Upanishads, but he thought it's too complicated for ordinary people. But the later scholars, Nagarjuna and so on, developed these very big texts. To me, there's no conflict. One's not better than the other. And Buddhism is so popular in the West now, but it was an offshoot of Hinduism. And Vedanta, of course, very clearly has no issue with anything. Vedanta is above it all. It says, well, you can have anything you want, so you get to finding out who you are. And it's not going to come through bhakti and so on. It's going to come through knowledge. You just have to know, and that's enlightenment. So I'm good with that. I like that.
Yes, I like that too. I do find that translation, boundlessness, to be appropriate in many ways, as it reminds me of Brahman, being that it comes from the root Brah, which I believe means to expand, and Brahman being a nominal nominal form of that, the all-expansive one, well, that's absolutely boundless. If it's boundless, it must be all-expansive. If it's all-expansive, it must be boundless. But I do find it funny that there are a lot of seemingly oppositional language in Buddhism and Advaita Vedanta. Of course, there's the binary of Atman versus Anatman. How more opposite could you get? And yet, to me, I feel like it's the difference between positive and negative zero.
Right.
If you look from the side of the positive, zero, of course, looks positive. But if you look at the side of the negatives, of course, zero looks negative. But being perfectly in between both, it's neither positive nor negative. I feel the same way about the Atma, that the Atma being nirguna can be described as beyond qualities and therefore, in some sense, not existent. It doesn't have any material existence. But that very absence of material qualities is the presence, is the existence of the Atma, which allows for the world to kind of exist on top.
It's wonderful that you're a mathematician and so advanced. I'm trying to think when I was your age, 20s, I wasn't a complete dolt about things that are spiritual. And because we used to go to various things. My father used to take us. I met a lot of spiritual leaders, but you're so advanced. It's just amazing. I feel like you should be my guru because you can. You seem very advanced.
I have a long way to go myself, and
Really?
there's so much for me still to learn. I feel like it is an infinite journey. I'm very grateful to be exactly where I am. You have been a wonderful addition to my journey in reading this book, and I know that it has made a deep impression on so many of our readers. It truly has been an honor. I thank you so much, and what a treat it is to be able to have this interview with you as the cherry on top, as I said. From the bottom of my heart, thank you. This book is a gift.
Thank you as well, because the books you normally read are by these great souls, either autobiographical, and you're doing Swami Radhanath, who's amazing. And thank you for picking my novel to sort of squeeze in there. It's totally not in the same league. And also Hollywood to the Himalayas was amazing, and Naturally Roar of the Ganges. So thank you for squeezing it in, because it was a great honor for me. Thank you.
No, of course. I know that you are very humble and you wouldn't make such a comparison, but I do consider you a Mahatma in many ways. So, such an honor that is. Is there any words that you'd like to give to the readers that sat through the many readings that we did and their continued journey to their own moksha as we end our interview?
It sounds odd, but I think what I'd like to tell someone who's beginning a journey is take ownership. It's about you finding who you are, figure it out. There's so much available, and they're starting being in your sangha and continuing. You started. Just be strong and understand that it's a very worthwhile. It's very important. You're going to have to make this journey in some life at some point, because this is the ultimate goal, enlightenment and moksha. So might as well move on and get going. And the people in your sangha, that's, if I can give anyone advice, it's take ownership of yourself.
Love that. Thank you. Well, we began with an invocation. I thought we'd close with invocation too. Om Asato Ma Sadgamaya Tamaso Ma Jyotirgamaya Mrityorma Mritangamaya. Om Shanti Shanti Shanti. Namaskaram.
Thank you.